In the autumn of 1971, a group of finance ministers gathered in Rome for what would become one of the most consequential meetings in monetary history. The Bretton Woods system, which had anchored the global economy for nearly 3 decades, was collapsing. Gold, once the bedrock of international currency stability, was being abandoned as the final link between money and tangible value. What happened next wasn't a crisis in the traditional sense. There were no bank runs, no breadlines, no immediate catastrophe. Instead, something more subtle began. A fundamental transformation in the nature of money itself, and with it, a quiet restructuring of who wins and who loses in the economic system. Today, more than 50 years later, we're living through the consequences of that transformation, and understanding its mechanics has never been more crucial. The statistics are stark, but they require context to understand their full meaning. Since the Federal Reserve's creation in 1913, the US dollar has lost approximately 96% of its purchasing power. A basket of goods that cost $1 in 1913 costs roughly $28 today. This isn't controversial data. It's published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. What remains intensely debated is whether this represents a system working as intended or slow-motion wealth extraction. The answer, as with most questions in economics, depends partly on which framework you use to analyze it. Mainstream economists, particularly those trained in Keynesian or new Keynesian traditions, often view moderate inflation as a feature rather than a bug. The argument goes something like this. Predictable, low inflation encourages spending and investment rather than hoarding, greases the wheels of wage adjustment during economic transitions, and provides central banks with tools to manage recessions. 2% inflation, the target embraced by most major central banks, is seen as an optimal balance between stability and flexibility. From this perspective, the purchasing power decline isn't theft, but rather the price of economic dynamism and crisis management capabilities. The alternative view, championed by Austrian economists and various monetary critics, sees the same data through a fundamentally different lens. They argue that consistent inflation represents a systematic transfer of wealth from holders of currency to those who receive newly created money first, from savers to debtors, and from wage earners to asset holders. This interpretation treats stable purchasing power not as an unrealistic goal, but as a basic function that money should perform. The debate isn't merely academic. It shapes how we understand everything from wage stagnation to wealth inequality to asset price inflation. Both perspectives contain legitimate insights, and the tension between them reflects genuine trade-offs in monetary system design. Now, what we can say with certainty is that the rules have changed dramatically over the past century, and those changes have created distinct winners and losers. To understand how we arrived at this moment, we need to trace the evolution of monetary systems with clear eyes about both continuity and change. For most of human history, money was commodity-based. Gold and silver weren't chosen arbitrarily. They possessed qualities that made them functional as money: durability, divisibility, portability, and most importantly, scarcity that couldn't be manipulated by any single authority. This scarcity imposed discipline. Governments couldn't simply create gold when they needed to finance wars or programs. They had to tax, borrow, or debase their coinage. And debasement eventually destroyed trust in the currency. The Roman Empire provides an instructive case study. At its height, the silver denarius contained about 95% pure silver. By the 3rd century, it had been debased to less than 5% silver content. The result was predictable: massive inflation, economic disruption, and eventual monetary collapse. But we should be cautious about drawing direct parallels to the present. Rome also faced military overextension, political instability, plague, and invasion. Monetary debasement was one factor among many in its decline, not a single cause. Still, the pattern appears repeatedly through history. When governments can expand the money supply without constraint, they generally do, and consequences follow. The gold standard era wasn't without its own problems, however, and honest analysis requires acknowledging them. Fixed money supplies meant that economic growth could be constrained by gold availability. This created deflationary pressures during rapid industrialization and led to financial panics when credit systems froze. The 19th century saw repeated banking crises, depressions, and social unrest, partly attributable to monetary rigidity. These were real costs. The transition away from gold happened in stages, driven by practical pressures as much as philosophical shifts. World War I forced most nations to abandon convertibility to finance military spending. The gold exchange standard of the 1920s proved unstable and contributed to the severity of the Great Depression. Bretton Woods, established after World War II, was itself a compromise, a gold-backed dollar that other currencies pegged to, providing stability while allowing more flexibility than pure gold standards. When Nixon closed the gold window in 1971, he wasn't implementing a master plan so much as acknowledging reality. The U.S. had printed more dollars than it held gold to back, particularly to finance Vietnam War spending and Great Society programs. Foreign governments, notably France under de Gaulle, began demanding gold for their dollar holdings. The system was unsustainable. What followed was the fiat currency era we still inhabit. Fiat money, backed by nothing but government decree and public trust, represents a fundamental experiment in monetary history. Advocates point to its flexibility in responding to crises, the ability to prevent deflation, and the escape from arbitrary constraints of commodity supply. The 2008 financial crisis provides their strongest case study. When credit markets froze and the economy contracted sharply, central banks could inject liquidity on a scale impossible under commodity money. Many economists credit this intervention with preventing a second Great Depression. Without the ability to expand the money supply dramatically, the argument goes, unemployment could have reached catastrophic levels. Critics counter that this very flexibility enables the cycles of boom and bust in the first place. Austrian business cycle theory suggests that artificially low interest rates, made possible by fiat money creation, mislead entrepreneurs about the true availability of savings and thus sustainable investment levels. This creates malinvestment and bubbles that eventually must correct. From this view, 2008 wasn't proof that fiat money works, but rather evidence that it creates crises, then claims credit for managing the fallout. The debate remains unresolved in academic economics, with both sides marshaling data to support their positions. What we can observe empirically is how monetary expansion affects different groups differently. This is where the concept of wealth transfer becomes most tangible. And when central banks create new money, it doesn't appear evenly distributed across the economy. It enters through specific channels: government spending, bank lending, asset purchases. Those closest to these channels benefit first. Financial institutions receive liquidity. Governments can fund programs without immediate tax increases. Asset holders see prices rise. By the time newly created money circulates through the broader economy and reaches wages, prices have already begun adjusting upward. The sequence is sometimes called the Cantillon effect, named after the 18th century economist Richard Cantillon, who first analyzed it systematically. The effect isn't conspiracy but mechanism. It's how monetary expansion works structurally. Someone who owns stocks, real estate, and bonds when central banks expand monetary base sees their assets appreciate. Someone living paycheck to paycheck on wages that adjust slowly sees their purchasing power decline before their income catches up, if it fully catches up at all. The data on wealth inequality over the past several decades shows this pattern clearly. The top decile, which holds the vast majority of financial assets, has seen wealth multiply. The middle and lower portions have seen stagnant or declining real wages and purchasing power. Monetary policy isn't the only factor driving this divergence. Globalization, technology, tax policy, declining union power, and numerous other variables contribute. But monetary expansion's role in asset price inflation while wages lag is difficult to deny. Consider housing as a concrete example. In 1970, the median U.S. home price was roughly $17,000, and median household income was about $9,000. The price-to-income ratio was under 2. By 2020, median home price exceeded $320,000, while median household income was roughly $68,000. The ratio had climbed to nearly 5. Houses didn't become 5 times better. The dynamic reflects multiple factors: zoning restrictions, limiting supply, and demographic shifts, changing household formation patterns, and indeed monetary policy that kept interest rates low and encouraged borrowing. This created a transfer. Homeowners who bought before prices inflated saw massive wealth gains. Younger generations face prices that are, relative to income, far more burdensome. This isn't a moral judgment about anyone's choices. It's a structural observation about how the system has evolved. Similar dynamics appear in stock markets, where price-to-earnings ratios have expanded significantly, particularly during periods of aggressive monetary easing. Whether this represents rational response to low interest rates or bubble dynamics remains hotly debated. What's clear is that asset holders have benefited enormously from monetary conditions of the past 15 years. The question that naturally follows is whether this can continue indefinitely. Here we enter territory of genuine uncertainty. Some economists argue that modern monetary systems face no inherent constraints so long as inflation remains moderate and debt is denominated in a currency the country controls. Modern monetary theory, a heterodox school gaining influence, suggests that currency-issuing governments cannot run out of money and should focus on inflation as the primary constraint rather than debt levels. From this view, Japan's experience with massive debt-to-GDP ratios yet low inflation demonstrates sustainability. Critics argue this underestimates long-term risks, that inflation could prove difficult to control once it escapes, that debt sustainability depends on continued confidence, which can evaporate suddenly, and that we're in unprecedented territory with global debt levels relative to GDP at record highs. Historical examples of currency collapse typically involve specific circumstances, Hyperinflation in Weimar Germany following World War I, reparations and occupation, Zimbabwe under Mugabe's catastrophic economic policies, Venezuela's combination of oil dependence and political dysfunction. These aren't perfect parallels to the United States or other major developed economies, but they illustrate that loss of confidence in fiat currency can occur, often faster than seems possible beforehand. The rise of central bank digital currencies adds another dimension to this evolving landscape. CBDCs represent programmable money, potentially allowing authorities granular control over how money can be used, tracked, and even expired. China's digital yuan is already in testing phases with millions of users. The European Central Bank is developing a digital euro. The Federal Reserve is researching a digital dollar. Proponents emphasize efficiency gains, reduced transaction costs, improved monetary policy transmission, and the ability to combat illicit finance. These are legitimate potential benefits. Critics raise concerns about surveillance, the elimination of cash as a privacy-preserving alternative, the potential for negative interest rates to be enforced on all holdings, and the concentration of power in central banking institutions. The technology is neutral in itself. Its implications depend entirely on how it's implemented and what restrictions are placed on governmental power. This deserves serious public debate rather than passive acceptance or reflexive rejection. The documented facts are that CBDCs are being developed globally and will likely become widespread within this decade. The interpretation of what this means for freedom and financial privacy depends on institutional design choices that haven't been fully made yet. Vigilance seems warranted regardless of one's broader economic philosophy. So what are the practical implications for individuals trying to navigate the system? Financial education typically emphasizes several principles that remain relevant regardless of monetary regime. Diversification across asset classes provides resilience. Understanding the difference between nominal and real returns is crucial. A savings account that pays 1% interest loses purchasing power if inflation runs at 3%. This seems obvious, yet is frequently misunderstood. Holding at least some assets that historically preserve purchasing power during inflationary periods makes sense for most people. This might include equities, which represent ownership in productive enterprises that can raise prices, real estate, commodities, or inflation-protected securities. The specific allocation depends on individual circumstances, risk tolerance, and time horizon. There's no universal prescription. Gold and silver often enter the conversation here as inflation hedges and crisis insurance. Historically, precious metals have maintained purchasing power across centuries. However, they produce no cash flow. Their prices can be extremely volatile in the short term, and they've had periods of poor performance even when inflation was elevated. The 1980s and 1990s saw gold lose value in real terms despite ongoing currency depreciation. Precious metals can play a role in a diversified portfolio, but treating them as a complete solution ignores their limitations. Cryptocurrency represents a newer asset class with passionate advocates and equally passionate critics. Bitcoin, launched in 2009 explicitly as a response to central banking monetary expansion, offers fixed supply and decentralized control. These properties appeal to those seeking an alternative to fiat systems. Whether Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies fulfill this promise remains uncertain. They face challenges including regulatory risk, technological questions about scaling, enormous price volatility, and the fact that they've existed only during an era of declining interest rates and monetary expansion. How they perform during a sustained period of central bank tightening or a major economic crisis remains unknown. They may represent revolutionary technology, a speculative bubble, or something in between. Including them in a financial plan should involve understanding their risks, which are substantial. The broader point is that diversification and education matter more than any single asset. Understanding how different investments respond to inflation, deflation, economic growth, recession, and changes in monetary policy enables better decision-making than chasing whatever asset class recently performed best. Perhaps more important than any specific investment strategy is developing financial resilience through multiple channels. This includes building emergency funds despite low savings account returns, maintaining employable skills that justify wage increases, controlling lifestyle inflation so that income gains translate to wealth accumulation, and understanding debt strategically. In an inflationary environment, fixed-rate debt becomes less burdensome over time in real terms, which helps borrowers but hurts lenders. This partially explains why governments with large debt loads might tacitly prefer inflation above their stated targets. For individuals, this means distinguishing between productive debt, used to acquire appreciating or income-producing assets, and consumptive debt used for depreciating purchases. The former can work in your favor in inflationary times. The latter compounds problems. Financial literacy, once a luxury, becomes increasingly essential as monetary systems grow more complex and their effects more consequential. The question of whether we're approaching another major crash or crisis requires acknowledging the limits of prediction. Every financial crisis looks obvious in hindsight, but was missed by most experts beforehand. The 2008 mortgage crisis had warnings, yet major institutions were caught catastrophically off guard. The dot-com bubble seemed clearly overvalued to some observers, yet timing the collapse was nearly impossible. Japan's asset bubble of the late 1980s created price-to-earnings ratios that screamed unsustainability, yet the bubble continued inflating beyond rational expectations. Markets can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent, as the saying goes. This doesn't mean indicators should be ignored. High debt levels, historically elevated asset valuations, persistent inflation combined with slowing growth, geopolitical tensions, and aging demographics in developed economies all present genuine challenges. But translating these observations into accurate timing of crashes is another matter entirely. The valuable insight isn't prediction, but preparation. Understanding risks allows you to position yourself to weather various scenarios, rather than betting everything on a single outcome. History suggests that major monetary transitions often occur during or after crises, rather than through careful planning. The gold standard wasn't abandoned during calm times, but under pressure of war and depression. Bretton Woods collapsed not through deliberate choice, but through unsustainable imbalances forcing change. If current monetary arrangements prove unsustainable, the transition will likely be messy, contested, and difficult to predict in its specifics. This might involve a return to commodity backing, though this seems politically unlikely given the constraints it imposes on government spending. It might involve new international monetary agreements, particularly if dollar dominance wanes as China, Russia, and other nations seek alternatives. It might involve cryptocurrency or other technologies playing larger roles, or it might involve muddling through with the current system, modified incrementally for longer than critics expect. Japan has maintained its monetary system despite predictions of crisis for decades. The US dollar remains the global reserve currency despite recurring warnings of imminent collapse. Inertia and lack of clear alternatives provide powerful stabilizing forces. What seems certain is that the coming decades will see continued monetary experimentation and evolution. The era of unconventional monetary policy, quantitative easing, negative interest rates, and direct central bank intervention in asset markets represents uncharted territory. We're conducting a grand experiment in real time. The outcomes aren't predetermined. This creates both risks and opportunities. Those who understand the system's mechanics, who maintain flexibility in their thinking and their financial arrangements, who stay informed about multiple perspectives, rather than treating one school of economic thought as gospel position themselves, better than those who either ignore these dynamics or embrace overly simplistic narratives about what must happen next. The world is too complex for easy answers, but it's not too complex for informed engagement. The monetary system we've inherited is neither purely villainous nor purely beneficial. It's a human construct that evolved through historical pressures, political compromises, practical crises, and competing visions of how economy and society should function. It has enabled unprecedented economic growth and lifted billions from poverty. It has also created distortions, transferred wealth in subtle and not so subtle ways, and concentrated power in institutions that may not always use it wisely. Both realities coexist. Understanding this doesn't tell you what will happen next. Markets will likely surprise in ways neither optimists nor pessimists fully anticipate. But understanding these dynamics equips you to think more clearly about the choices ahead. It allows you to make decisions based on comprehension rather than fear, on principles rather than panic. And in an era of monetary experimentation where the rules keep changing, clear thinking coupled with intellectual humility about what we cannot know might prove the most valuable assets of all. The transfer of wealth isn't just happening through monetary mechanisms. It's happening through knowledge itself, through understanding systems that shape our economic lives. That kind of wealth, once gained, is far harder to inflate away.